Hallo, hier ist wieder Mareike und ich begrüße euch herzlich bei Wanderwach und Kaffee. Diese Episode wird ein bisschen anders als die anderen Episoden und auch eine etwas spezielle Episode, denn diese Episode kommt zu euch live vom Continental Divide Trail. Denn ich bin gerade ein paar Tage, zu Besuch, zu Gast auf dem CDT und ich dachte mir, vielleicht ist es einmal ganz interessant, ein bisschen vom CDT zu berichten. Da ich aber nur ein paar Tage hier unterwegs bin, macht es eigentlich wenig Sinn, dass ich mich selbst interviewe und euch monologisierend vom Continental Divide Trail erzähle. Nein, deshalb habe ich mir etwas ganz Besonderes und etwas sehr anderes überlegt. Denn ja, es gibt eine ganz besondere Person, die ich hier besuche und die in dieser Episode mein Gast sein wird. Und ich freue mich ganz besonders, denn mein heutiger Gast ist mein eigener Freund. Und dieser wandert nämlich gerade den CDT und ich besuche ihn hier. Eigentlich haben wir für 2020 geplant, den Continental Divide Trail zusammen zu wandern. Aber ich glaube, ich muss nicht nochmal besonders erwähnen, was 2020 passiert ist. Und so haben wir das verschoben und dann kam auf meiner Seite ein anderer Job, ein neuer Job dazwischen, der es mir einfach nicht erlaubt, dann mal locker 4, 5, 6 Monate am Stück dann mal wieder unterwegs zu sein. Beziehungsweise ich habe mich für den tollen Job entschieden. Und ja, nun geht mein Freund, mein wonderful Partner, geht den Trail jetzt allein und ich besuche ihn hier. Und ich nutze die Gelegenheit, euch daher vom Trail eine Episode zu schicken und ein bisschen zu erzählen oder meinen Freund erzählen zu lassen, was er bisher so erlebt hat und wo wir sind und was überhaupt der Continental Divide Trail für ein Wanderweg ist. Und mein Freund spricht kein Deutsch, er ist kein Deutscher, er ist Amerikaner. Deshalb auch das Besondere heute bei der Folge, die Folge wird auf Englisch sein. Und ich würde sagen, wir starten dann gleich mal. Ach ja, vielleicht noch als kleinen Disclaimer. Also mein Freund heißt John, auf dem Trail bekannt als Longstride. Und mir wird es wahrscheinlich passieren, dass mir immer mal so ein Honey rausrutscht, wenn ich ihm eine Frage stelle. Okay, also das ist ganz authentisch und ich hoffe, es gefällt euch, dass ich euch aber ein paar Trail-Geschichten quasi live und authentisch vom CDT mitbringe. Okay, ich würde sagen, wir legen los und viel Spaß beim Zuhören. So welcome to my podcast, honey. I already mentioned in the intro that this episode will be a special one. We are recording live on trail and it will be also in English. I also introduced you already as John in real life, Longstride on trail. And from time to time, I might let a honey slip. So, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
So, why are you out here hiking the CDT, the Continental Divide Trail?
In 2016, I had the opportunity to hike the Appalachian Trail. And I hadn't heard of the Continental Divide Trail at the time. At least I don't think I had. But after a week, I met a hiker who had hiked the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail, collectively the Triple Crown of hiking in the United States. At the time, I had no plans on doing anything other than the Appalachian Trail. But sometime along the trail, I fell in love with long-distance hiking. And I knew that not only was I going to complete the Appalachian Trail, but I was also going to hike the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail. So I'd originally planned on... So I completed the Appalachian Trail in 2016, and I did the Pacific Crest Trail in 2018, and my plan was to do the Continental Divide Trail in 2020, but 2020 was not a good year for anything. So I'm out here now hiking the Continental Divide Trail because it's just beautiful out here.
And it's out here, so why not hike it?
Exactly.
Okay, so I guess there might be quite a few people out there who probably never heard of the Continental Divide Trail, or maybe there are also quite a lot of people who heard of the Continental Divide Trail but don't know any further details about it. So what exactly is the Continental Divide Trail, apart from being one of the big 3 long-distance trails in the U.S. that together are the Triple Crown?
So the Continental Divide Trail, as the name suggests, it generally follows the Continental Divide in the United States from the Mexican border in New Mexico up through Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, ending at the border with Canada. And
it starts at the Mexican border, right?
Or ends, depending upon your direction of travel.
Yeah.
The Continental Divide is, roughly speaking, a line. And on one side of the line, any water that falls will find its way into the Pacific Ocean. On the other side, water finds its way into the Atlantic Ocean. So it is a rather prominent geological feature. The Continental Divide Trail is roughly about 3,000 miles long, give or take a few hundred miles, depending upon whether you follow the official trail or whether you take one of the many, many alternate routes.
Why are there alternate routes?
In some cases, the trail is difficult or unfriendly, and one might choose to go a different way that is better or more interesting. For example, one route that a significant number of hikers take is the Gila River alternate. The official CDT goes through a extremely dry and very remote section through the Black Mountain Range. The Gila River alternate instead follows and actually crosses the Gila River about 200 times over the course of a few days. And
Wet feet,
yes. And the alternate and the official route couldn't possibly be any more different. It's 2 very, very different experiences. And that alternate is in New Mexico, where up to that point, the trail has gone through a very dry desert. And so, faced with the prospect of more desert or an overabundance of water, many hikers, myself included, choose to go through the Gila because it's completely different from everything that's come before. And there's a lot of other alternates that the official CDT is perfectly fine, but the alternate provides a different experience.
Would you say that taking the alternates significantly shorten the trail or even make it longer?
Some make it shorter, some make it longer. The Gila alternate is about 60 or 70 miles shorter than the official route, for example.
So basically, would you say that hiking the CDT is also something like choose your own adventure, because you can choose alternates, whether choosing like dry desert in New Mexico or the Gila alternate, which gives you wet feet because you have to cross the Gila River for 200 times?
The CDT is very much a choose your own adventure trail, as compared to, for example, the Appalachian Trail, where there's basically one route: follow the white blazes.
Yeah. Okay. So right now we are lying in the tent at about 3,600 meters, which is pretty high up in the Rocky Mountains, somewhere in Colorado. It's dark outside, and I can see the moon is coming up, and it's really pretty. It's also pretty cold. It's like we're in July, and it's only something like 8 or 9 degrees Celsius. So we all huddled in our sleeping bags. And apart from that, where exactly are we at the moment? Maybe you could elaborate on where exactly we are, because you are the trail expert. You've been on trail for much longer than I am, because this is my first day on the CDT, actually.
So we are about 1,301 miles from the southern terminus. We are just inside the border of the James Peak Wilderness, in a national park whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce.
It started with an A, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
I don't know it either, how to pronounce it. No idea. Sorry.
And yeah, we're a couple miles away from the last peak above 13,000 feet on the trail going north.
Mm-hmm. And we saw a moose today. It was actually the first moose I've ever seen in my life, but it was not the first moose you saw on trail, correct?
No, I saw a moose a couple weeks ago, actually on an alternate route.
So it's worth taking the alternates.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what about wildlife in general?
I have seen a couple of moose. There's up here in the mountains, there's been marmots all over the place.
What about rattlesnakes in New Mexico?
Yeah, came across a couple.
Any bears so far?
I have not seen any bears so far.
Do you expect to see any bears?
Probably further north.
Yeah. So when you refer to further north, where exactly do you think you're going to see bears, or which areas?
Almost certainly in Montana.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't know.
Okay. So for me, this is the first day on the CDT, and I'm only visiting for a couple of days. So I'm pretty happy that I'm here for a couple of days, because it's great being out here hiking.
It's great to have you here.
Yay! It's always great to hike together, right? So this is my first day, and you picked me up in Denver, and we arrived in Winter Park, and then we headed on that trail, and now we're lying in this tent, and there are still a couple of more days to come, which is awesome. But how long have you already been on that trail?
Well, I started on April the 25th, and today is July the 13th. So it's been 2.5 months.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's probably a tough question, or it's probably too early to ask this question. However, I have to ask this question, because you've been hiking the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. And I've also hiked the PCT, the Pacific Crest Trail. And I know the Appalachians a little tiny bit also. But so far, how would you compare the CDT to the PCT and the AT?
Nothing really compares to the Appalachian Trail. The CDT would be more similar to the Pacific Crest Trail, in that just the sort of terrain that you're likely to encounter is a lot more similar. Both California and New Mexico have substantial deserts. There are no deserts on the Appalachian Trail.
No. Sometimes you'd wish for a desert, because it's so humid in the Appalachians from time to time, right?
Most of the Continental Divide Trail is higher than all of the Appalachian Trail. So the types of mountains out here and the types of forests are a lot different than that of the AT. It's somewhat similar to the PCT. The PCT, even though it's called the Pacific Crest Trail, rarely actually follows any sort of ridge. Usually it's below going along the side of mountains, and then maybe it shoots up and down and up and over and down a pass. But the PCT doesn't summit a single mountain. The Appalachian Trail summits probably somewhere between 150 and 200 mountains.
Wow.
The CDT doesn't summit a whole lot of mountains, but it, especially in the last week or two, it's actually summited quite a few. And the CDT actually spends a lot of time at or near the top of a ridge. So you get a feeling like you're on top of everything, because you kind of are.
And the PCT is also known as like the picture perfect trail, with having panoramic views every single second. And you have those amazing views over mountainous areas and desert areas. How is it on the CDT?
It's a lot the same. There's a lot of times where you're above the tree line, and it's beautiful views everywhere you look.
Okay. Since we spoke about the CDT first, we hiked 3 days together on the Continental Divide Trail. And as you might hear, my voice is pretty hoarse because apparently the altitude got to me. So sometimes altitude causes my sinuses to be a little bit messy, and then it gets to my vocal cords, and as a result, I'm hoarse. So excuse me for sounding a little weird, but I am not the guest in my podcast. I'm just asking weird questions. And John/Longstride/ my honey is here to answer a couple of more questions. But before we get to my first question of today, during the last couple of days, I also got to experience a glimpse of what the trail is actually like. So at the moment, we are staying for a 0 day in a lodge in the little town of Grand Lake. And before we specifically speak about the section we hiked together, let me just say, these last 3 days were incredibly beautiful, but also very brutal. And there is a reason why people say that the motto of the trail is embrace the brutality. So what do you think so far? Is this a motto that matches with your experiences of the trail? Embrace the brutality?
There's, especially in Colorado, a lot of the trail, especially when there's snow, is really hard, exhausting, tiring, brutal. And if you're not willing to put up with that, which is pretty hard at times, but you have to if you want to hike this trail. So yeah, it's not a bad motto.
I also think what it makes so brutal for me for the last 3 days, I basically came from sea level to, I think the highest elevation we've been hiking in were something like 4,020 meters or so. So this was kind of brutal. But yeah, so you were already saying that there is a lot of snow also in the Colorado mountains. What else makes the trail hard? Or maybe you disagree and the trail is not even that hard.
No, it's hard. In particular, there's a lot of exposure. So the trail is very regularly above the tree line. So you have no break from the sun, unless a happy little cloud happens to float between the sun and you. So yeah, there's a lot of exposure. In some places, the trail is barely a trail.
Oh yeah, we saw that too.
Especially in Colorado, the trail is very high in elevation. I think, except when I was in town, the entire time I've been in Colorado, all of my campsites have been above 10,000 feet, which is kind of ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So even parts of the trail that aren't especially steep, it's still really hard to hike when you're at 10 or 12 or 13,000 feet.
How much is this in meters? Between like 3,000 and 4,000, 4,200 meters maybe? Something like that?
10,000 feet is about 3,000 meters.
Yeah. And 13,000 feet?
13,000 feet is almost 4,000 meters.
Yeah, it's almost 4,000 meters. So did you ever feel any, high altitude sickness symptoms? Did you ever have the impression, ooh, the elevation gets to me?
Apart from just not having as much energy and climbing high elevation mountains being harder than I'm used to it being at lower elevations, no, not really.
Mm-hmm. I mean, also when you're hiking, you approach mountains in a much slower pace than you would with a car, or if you land with a plane on a high plateau, I don't know, for example, right?
Yes.
So yeah, you were saying the trail is hard, brutal even, but there seemed to be an influx in hikers, especially this season. Well, we're speaking of 2022. What do you think? Why is that?
Well, I shouldn't say after because it's still going on, but as a result of the COVID epidemic, in 2019, 2020, and 2021, it was very difficult or impossible for foreign hikers to come to the United States to hike any of the trails here. So this year was the first year where, in a while, where people could come to this country to hike. But
it's not just international. It's not just foreigners who are on the trails.
No, but a lot of people who couldn't before now have the opportunity. And of the big three trails, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail, in recent years, the AT has been overcrowded at the start, and the Pacific Crest Trail has a 50 start per day limit for northbound hikers, and almost all of those spots are taken very early on. So the Continental Divide Trail is usually has far fewer hikers than there are this year. This year there's a lot more hikers just because there's more people trying to hike the trails, and they can't get onto the PCT, and they don't want to go to the AT. Mm-hmm. So they wind up on the CDT.
Would you say that the CDT is a good beginner trail? Because it sounds like a lot of people cannot get a permit or couldn't get a permit for the PCT, don't want to hike the AT, so they decide for the CDT.
Well, there are a lot of people on trail this year for which this is their first long-distance trail. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the CDT as a first trail because it's so hard, but people make it work.
I mean, it's one step at a time. Well, yeah, it's not just that, I know. Okay. And, well, yeah, the last 3 days, we two have been hiking together. And we hiked from Berthoud Pass, which is near Winter Park, to the town of Grand Lake, where we're at right now. And in total, these were about 90 kilometers. What would you say what was special about this section?
That's really kind of a hard question. This section of trail did include the last two mountains over 13,000 feet.
So the last 3 days, we hiked together from Berthoud Pass near Winter Park to the town of Grand Lake. So in total, these were about 90 kilometers. We hiked in 3 days. For me, this was kind of special / brutal, because as I said before, that I basically came from sea level as I was on a 6-week cycling trip through Finland, which is basically flat, all the way to northern Norway, which is, little rolling hills at almost sea level. And then I got to the Colorado Rocky Mountains that are kind of high. And special about the last 90 kilometers was that John and I, we went over the last 2 13ers on the CDT going north. And this was pretty special because coming from sea level and going over 2 13ers, that's rough, I would say. Do you agree?
Oh, yes.
And what was also special, apart from the elevation, got to my sinuses and my voice, as everyone could probably hear. Also special was that we had a lodge booked in Grand Lake, which is a trail town along the Continental Divide Trail. And as we were a little exhausted on day one, we had to kind of pick up the pace on our third day. So that meant that we had to hike about 26 miles on day 3, which is more than a marathon. So it's more than 42 kilometers. So, it was pretty tough, pretty special. But I have to say that I really enjoyed this section because the scenery in the Rockies, in the Colorado Rockies, is just incredible. You have those high mountains, which are almost snow-capped and a lot of granite. And then you have those high plateaus and meadows, and you have wildflowers, and you have just those amazing views. And in the valleys you see Winter Park and Grand Lake, and you also have lakes. I skinny dipped in a lake, which was awesome because we were also experiencing a couple of hot days here. So what I was experiencing the last 3 days, would you say this is something typical for the CDT? Is this typically Colorado CDT style that we experienced the last 3 days?
I feel like this was hard for Colorado. Going over 13,000-foot peaks within 2 days. And we'd planned to do it in 1 day, actually.
Impossible.
Was challenging. And then on the second day in this section, there was a fairly long stretch where the trail was practically non-existent. Like, if you looked, you could sort of kind of see a depression where people were hiking. But the trail was more of an idea rather than an actual thing that was built.
Mm-hmm.
And since it was along a grassy, rocky ridge, and the views were spectacular, but it was exhausting and slow going because the trail was so indistinct. And that's pretty unusual for Colorado.
Uh-huh. Okay. So at the moment we are in Grand Lake. So we made it on like the third day after having hiked a marathon to town. And we are zeroing here. And when you're hiking long distance trails, especially in the US, you are, you know all the vocab that is hiking specific. But for the ones who are listening to us right now who don't know what a zero is, what is it? What is a 0 day or a neuro day? So please give us some insight into trail vocabulary.
So a 0 is a day in which you hike 0 miles.
Sounds awesome.
Usually you got into town the day before, and you spend a day relaxing and doing chores like eating and more eating and getting food for the next section. A Nero is nearly 0 miles. So what exactly that means differs depending on who you are, but generally if you hike 5 miles or less, or some people would say 10 miles or less, and going into a town, then that's a Nero, because you've done nearly nothing.
Mm-hmm. So, and once you're in town, you were already saying you eat. And you eat? And yes, you eat. What else do you do when you're in town? Are there other chores you have to take care of?
The main thing is resupplying for the next section. On a trail like the CDT, where some of the towns that you might go into don't actually have a grocery store, or they might have one, but it's poorly stocked for hiker needs, then you might buy extra food, stick it in a box, take it to the post office, and mail it ahead to another town that you can't shop in.
How do you know where to mail it to?
There are lists and guides available for the describe what the trail towns are and what services are available. And just based on prior experience from other hikers, there winds up being a general recommendation on where it's good to buy food and where you should send a box.
Like send it to a post office in another town or to a hotel, or where do you normally send a box to?
It depends on the town. Sending to a post office is easy, but post offices, especially in small towns, aren't always open, very convenient hours, and rarely on the weekends. So you really have to watch when you're getting into town. The worst thing would be to show up in town on a Friday after the post office closes and have to stick around until the post office opens on Monday. So sometimes the post office isn't an option, so there may be hotels or there may be community centers or local businesses that are willing to accept packages for trail hikers.
So and how do you actually get to town? Because, I mean, we got to Grand Lake here because the CDT goes through Grand Lake. So we didn't need to hitch or find a way to get to town. How is it in general on the CDT? I mean, so far, New Mexico and Colorado. Does the trail go through towns, or do you have to, I don't know, go out of your way to kind of find your way to town?
In New Mexico, the trail actually goes through nearly all of the trail towns. Rather, you don't need to go off trail if you don't want to in New Mexico. In Colorado, there's only a handful of trail towns that are actually on trail. So it generally means that you get to a trailhead and you have to try and hitch into town.
Yeah, so how hard or how easy actually is it to get into town? Because, here we are in Grand Lake and the trail goes through the town of Grand Lake. But I believe it's not always the case. And if I recall how things were while I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, for me as a single female hiker for most of the time, it was not that hard to hitch a ride to actually get to town. Also because of people were aware of that there is a long distance hiking trail, the PCT, in the vicinity. How is it along the CDT? Are people aware of the CDT? Do you have to hitch because towns are off trail? Yeah, how is it? How do you get to town?
Well, in Colorado, most of the trail towns are off trail. So the easiest way into town is to hitch, unless you want to hike into town, which most people don't do.
So you show your 10 line and then you hitch a ride?
Or something, yeah.
So are people aware of the CDT and therefore give hikers a ride easily?
Some people are. Some areas it's easier to hitch in than others. It really depends on how much traffic and what area it is. Some areas are just easier to hitch in than others.
And in general, how's the hiker community so far? Like the people you hike with or also the people off trail?
I mean, all of the hikers that I've met have been fantastic. Everyone's out here doing a really difficult thing, and there's a lot of support amongst hikers. The trail communities, it depends on the individual towns. Some towns are very hiker friendly, some are less so, and it just depends.
Mm-hmm. So you are now almost 1,000 miles into your hike. There are about more or less 2,000 more miles to come, I believe.
More or less.
Yeah. So what are you looking forward to on the next, many miles?
I'm really looking forward to Yellowstone, Yellowstone National Park. I was there when I was a kid, and it was fantastic. So it's the one place on trail that I've been to before. So I'm looking forward to it again.
So when do you think you're gonna hit Yellowstone?
I'm not sure, hopefully within the next month.
Okay. Isn't it incredible in which timely dimensions we are talking when we're talking about a long distance trail? I think it's incredible. What keeps you going on a long distance trail? Because hiking a trail such as the CDT, which is like roughly, because it's, remember, choose your own adventure, it's roughly like 3,000 miles. I believe when you're on trail, you also have bad days. How do you keep going? How do you motivate yourself?
Well, generally, whatever's causing a problem almost always is temporary. So the solution is keep hiking and eventually the problem goes away. But I always try to finish what I start. So in as much as anything, that's my motivation for continuing on.
Mm-hmm. And I can almost picture you at the Northern Monument next to the Canadian border. All right. Thank you very much, honey, for a little bit of insight into your CDT hike so far. And thank you for sharing it with my podcast listeners.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Ja, das war also meine Folge mit John /Longstride direkt vom CDT, vom Continental Divide Trail. Ich habe leider meinen Süßen zurückgelassen und bin von Denver aus mit dem Greyhound-Bus nach Las Vegas gefahren, wo ich noch Freunde aus Kalifornien getroffen habe und wo ich noch die nächsten Tage verbringe, bis mein Flug nach Deutschland geht. John wandert ja natürlich weiter. Ich habe ihn ganz schweren Herzens auf dem Trail dann verabschiedet. Und ja, er ist jetzt wenige Meilen vor Wyoming, hat dann Colorado fast fertig erwandert. Und ja, ich hoffe, euch hat auch gefallen, was ihr gehört habt, denn das war einmal eine etwas andere Episode, denn sie war auf Englisch und sie war direkt auf dem CDT aufgenommen. Eigentlich ideal, wenn man einen Podcast übers Weitwandern macht, direkt auch mal von einem dieser legendären 3 großen Weitwander-Trails auch aus den USA zu berichten. Also ja, wenn ihr weiterverfolgen möchtet, wie es Longstride so auf seiner CDT-Wanderung ergeht, dann könnt ihr das gerne machen, denn John bloggt über seine Wanderung und ihr findet seine Posts auf longstride.net. Er schreibt tatsächlich über jeden einzelnen Tag, aber momentan hängt er ein bisschen hinterher, da es mit dem Internet manchmal ein bisschen schwierig ist, immer die Blogposts zu uploaden. Aber ihr könnt über die ersten momentan 53 Tage auf dem Trail lesen. Ihr könnt über seine Vorbereitungen lesen, über seine Ausrüstung, die er dabei hat. Und ihr könnt natürlich grandiose Bilder betrachten, die er bisher so aufgenommen hat. Okay, also meine Lieben, wenn euch Wanderwache und Kaffee gefallen hat, dann abonniert mich gerne und damit ihr keine neue Folge verpasst, selbstverständlich. Und vergebt auch gerne ein paar Sterne in eurer Podcast-App, denn das hilft Wanderwach und Kaffee natürlich auch von anderen Weitwanderbegeisterten besser gefunden zu werden. Gut, das soll es für heute gewesen sein. Ich schicke liebe Grüße in alle Richtungen und wünsche wie immer Happy Trails. Bis bald, bis zur nächsten Episode. Eure Mareike.